Hi everyone! This video will discuss the three main types of psychological research designs: correlational research designs, experimental research designs, and quasi-experimental research designs. Quantitative research is, at its most basic level, repeated attempts to identify potential causes and effects. However, in research we use slightly different language. We refer to variables we think cause something as explanatory variables, and variables we think are affected by something as outcome variables. Explanatory variables are variables we believe cause, precede, or influence a particular outcome. Outcome or response variables are impacted or affected by explanatory variables. Any change or difference observed in the outcome variable of a study is thought to be explained by the explanatory variable. An explanatory variable can be anything that might affect the response variable. In some studies, there's only one explanatory variable, and in other studies, there may be multiple explanatory variables. The type of study design we use to better understand how variables influence or affect one another depends on what it is we're studying. With correlational research designs, what we're really trying to get at is there a relationship between our explanatory variable and our outcome variable? With experimental research designs, we want to know, does our explanatory variable cause our outcome variable? And with quasi-experimental research designs, what we want to know is there a difference between group 1 and group 2 on our outcome variable? Each type of research design has different language for the explanatory and outcome variables. In an experimental research design, explanatory variables are called independent variables, and outcome variables are called dependent variables. An independent variable is a variable that we think or we hypothesize causes a change in the dependent variable. In an experimental study, the independent variable is the variable that the researcher changes or manipulates to see if the dependent variable is affected by it. The dependent variable is what the researcher measures to determine if there are any differences or changes due to what is being manipulated in the independent variable. For a study to be considered experimental, it needs to have three things: random selection, random assignment, and a control group. Random selection is when our sample is randomly selected from the population we're interested in studying. Random assignment is when the participants in the research study sample are randomly assigned to either the treatment group or to the control group. For example, let's say we're interested in studying the effect of distracting sounds on student test scores. Our independent variable that we're going to manipulate in this example is exposure to distracting sounds. Our dependent variable that we're going to measure to see if there's a change due to the independent variable is test scores. The control group will not be exposed to the distracting sounds. The experimental or treatment group will be exposed to the distracting sounds. When participants are assigned to either the control group or the treatment group, they must be randomly assigned. Each participant needs to have an equal chance of either being in the control group or in the treatment group. This allows us to control for potential confounding variables. For example, some people may enjoy doing work with music or TV on in the background, while other people need everything to be quiet in order to focus. Random assignment helps us account for some of those individual differences between our participants because we are likely to have an equal amount of people who prefer background noise in each group if we use random assignment. Sometimes the variable we think affects the outcome variable is something that we can't manipulate or change as a researcher. When that happens, we either do a correlational or a quasi-experimental research design instead. For example, if we wanted to see if there's a difference in the amount of pages assigned to high school students and college students taking English classes, it would be difficult to randomly assign students to either be in a high school versus a college English class. It would be easier to study students who are already grouped into those classes. If we cannot randomly assign participants to a group, we conduct a quasi-experimental research study. In a quasi-experimental research design, explanatory variables are called grouping variables and outcome variables are called dependent variables. A grouping variable is still the variable we think causes a change in the dependent variable, such that we believe being in one group versus another impacts the dependent variable. Examples of grouping variables used in research include age and gender. In aging research, cognitive psychologists may compare brain activation patterns between young and older adults. Since we can't randomly assign someone to be young or old, this type of study would have to be quasi-experimental. Correlational research designs are used to study naturally occurring or unmanipulated variables. Oftentimes, these are variables we're unable to manipulate as researchers, potentially due to ethical concerns. For example, I do research on experiences with discrimination. It would not be ethical for me to expose someone to discrimination so I can see how that impacts their mental health. So instead, I measure how often they have experienced, for example, ageism, and I measure their current level of well-being, and I see how are those two variables related to one another and whether experiences with discrimination predicts well-being. In a correlational research design, explanatory variables are called predictor variables and outcome variables are called criterion variables. A predictor variable is the variable we think comes first and drives the relationship between the predictor variable and the criterion variable. One of the major differences between correlational research designs and experimental research designs are the conclusions you can draw from them. Because experimental research designs have random selection, random assignment, and control groups, we are able to infer a cause and effect relationship between the independent and the dependent variables. With correlational research designs, we don't have that kind of control over our variables since we're studying variables that are occurring naturally. One of the reasons we can't infer causation is because there may be other variables impacting our criterion variable that we aren't measuring or we aren't aware of. For example, there's a strong correlation between age and COVID-19 mortality rates. The older a person is, the more likely they are to die if they contract COVID-19, and this relationship is particularly strong in older adults 75 years and older. So does age cause a higher mortality rate? Does X cause Y? Or is there another variable at play? We also know people with chronic health conditions, regardless of their age, also have higher mortality rates. And as people grow older, they are more likely to have chronic health conditions, particularly if they're older than 75. So is it really age that is driving this relationship, or is it the presence of a chronic health condition? With correlational research designs, we're not able to answer questions of cause and effect. All we can do is look at the relationships between these variables. To recap, there are three main types of psychological research designs: correlational, experimental, and quasi-experimental. Each of these different types of designs answers a different type of research question. Correlational research designs help us determine if there's a relationship between two variables. Experimental research designs help us determine is there a cause and effect relationship between two variables. And quasi-experimental research designs help us see is there a difference between these two groups on this dependent variable of interest.